In this video, I'm going to be discussing Ableton 11's quantizing and warping function for audio. Alright, so there is a saw wave with a slow attack on a triplet grid. I'll play it again. So I set the grid to triplets and you'll see that Ableton automatically generated transients. When you quantize the audio in Ableton, the transients will simultaneously become warp markers and will shift the audio on grid. There's been many instances where I've wanted to quantize the transients before the warp markers. So let me requantize that and you'll notice that the inserts have been warped and they're slightly off. Alright, I'm gonna undo the quantize and explain why this is happening to begin with. Ableton automatically puts these inserts in where it thinks there are transients. If the sound has a slow attack, it's not always accurate. If you're using beats in one-shot mode, you'll know that there's no triplets in the preserves, it's only straight notes. If you switch the preserves to transients, it triggers the sound on the insert. Since the transients aren't quantized, this is off beat. What you have to do to put it on beat is you have to click shift and move these inserts over manually. Or you click shift command I, and that will insert new transients. Then you have to delete the old ones. As you can guess, this process will take a while if you have a longer audio clip. Now that I've manually quantized it, I'll go ahead and play it and modulate the preserve envelope. Now that the transients are on grid, I'll move this loop over and play what it sounded like before. As you can hear, it's slightly off. So let me reiterate that there is no quantize feature for inserts. When you quantize audio, you will warp the transients and shift the waveform itself. Currently, you have to move these transients on grid or replace them with new ones manually. Also, there is no automation lane for the preserve envelope, meaning you can't draw in this kind of effect. Hang on, let me move this loop over where it's quantized. So you can't automate that envelope, it's not available in this drop-down. But in things like texture, you can automate the grain size and flux. You just go to this drop-down, select your parameter, and draw it in. The overall value of this will correspond to how open you have this envelope, but there is no automation available for beats. Currently, you would have to modulate this by hand and resample it into a new audio track. The same thing applies to Complex Pro and its parameters. Having automation here and being able to quantize inserts separately from warp markers would give you much more control over your sound and save time editing in many ways. One last thing that I want to say is that the phaser-flanger have a frequency rate and a BPM sync, while the chorus-ensemble only has a frequency rate. Having the option to also sync this to BPM would be ideal. So let's go back to the topic of transients and warp markers. Now that I've gone over the fundamentals of how transients and warp markers affect your audio, let's put this to a more practical use. Let's say you're DJing in Ableton's session view, and you're about to bring in a new, previously unwarped audio track. You drop it in there, and it will warp depending on your settings. In this case, it didn't warp it to the proper tempo, so let me just correct that. I know this tempo is 126 and not 128. I have to set 1-1 at the beginning transient, and now it should be on tempo when I replay it. Usually when Ableton brings in a new sample, it warps it and it gets it right most of the time, but sometimes it's not always correct. I'll show you my preferences here and you'll see that I do have auto warp long samples turned on. So right now I have Ableton set to automatically figure out how it should warp samples. I'm gonna skip ahead here and we're gonna listen for anything that sounds off. right there in the kick. You can hear what sounds like a slow attack on the kick. When your warp mode is set to beats and your preserves are set to transients, the audio will trigger on each transient. If one is slightly off-grid, you will hear it trigger off-grid. This becomes more apparent when the track tempo and the project tempo are different. When you quantize audio, warp markers are placed over transients and then snap the waveform to the grid. As you can see, the warp marker moved the kick slightly off-grid because the transient wasn't quantized first. And you can also hear it doesn't solve the problem with the slow attack on the kick. So again, to move these transients on grid, you have to click Shift and move them over by hand, or you delete the old one and insert a new one with Command Shift I. Now that I've corrected these two, I'll play it back. In this scenario, placing the transient on the quarter note solves the problem with the kick having a slow attack. And keep in mind you have to do this manually. What I would suggest is an option in quantize settings that lets you quantize transients and warp markers independently. The function of quantizing would still be the same, where you could choose your grid and you can also choose the amount, but you would have an extra option that lets you quantize between transients and warp markers. So instead of placing warp markers over the transients and moving the audio, you would have the option to quantize the transients without affecting the waveform. I'll play it back and you'll hear the kick on bar 51 has a solid attack now. I'll keep playing it until we hear another kick that's off. That didn't take very long. I'll play it again in case you missed it. For another example, I'm going to drop in a track with triplets. Alright, I'm going to change the tempo to the proper tempo, which is 134. Next, I'm going to set 1-1 at the beginning of this kick. I'm going to double click and insert a warp marker. You can actually see this transient's off, but since we're setting 1-1 after it, we will not worry about it. Alright, so now I'll play it for you. Actually, let me change the master tempo to 134 as well. For this example, I'm going to leave it at 128 though. So you might be saying there's quarter notes in the preserves, you can quantize your kick that way. And I agree, but you will hear a spacing between each quarter note. The sound between each preserve will shorten or lengthen depending on the tempo you have set in your DAW or the transpose set on the track. Listen to the spacing here between each eighth note. This is happening because my master tempo is different than the track tempo. I mentioned earlier that the preserves do not include triplets. It's only straight notes. So to make triplets, you would have to use the transient preserve. You can also tell it's not perfectly quantized. So let's zoom in and see where these transients are. I'm going to go ahead and make it a triplet grid and set it to eighth notes. So I'm just going to point out a couple of the transients that are off with the cursor. There's one. Let's see, two. You can see some are just very slightly off. So again, there is no way to quantize all of these at once. You would have to go in and move every single one of them by hand. You can imagine how long this would take if you were to actually go and do this, so no one does it. This is why no one uses Beats mode for live. And it's also why Beats mode is so apparent in people's productions, because no one really goes in and quantizes these transients. It takes way too much time to do this by hand. It's really sad because a lot of people don't use Beats mode to its full potential, and it is one of the most powerful tools in Ableton. I use it all the time, but I will always end up having to correct these transients that are auto-generated. and I'm pretty much only using audio in my productions. So I run into this problem way too often. There's no doubt I've spent hours correcting transients since Live 8. In this example, you could see how many transients are off the grid. It's almost all of them. I'm not even correcting the ones that are just a hair off. I'm only correcting the ones that are going to be noticeable. But you get the idea. Having an option that lets you choose between quantizing transients and warp markers separately would give you a whole new level of control over your audio, and it will save you a lot of time. You can imagine how having transients and warp markers separate in the groove pool could be useful as well. Another thing I realized while I was making this video is that when you go into your MIDI mapping section, you can MIDI map transpose, and you can also MIDI map the gain. But you can't MIDI map the fine tune or the envelopes of any warp mode. I'll go ahead and change the mode so you can see. You cannot MIDI map. Also, the MIDI mappings for your audio are globally controlled, meaning that no matter what channel strip they're on, your MIDI mapping will control every audio clip in the project. You can see the MIDI mapping is on both of these tracks, but I only assigned it to one. I feel like the mapping should be channel strip dependent rather than global. That way you can control more than one audio channel at a time. So let's play this and change the transpose over MIDI. The highlighted clip is what the MIDI will control. So if you accidentally highlight another track while transposing, it could change the value out of nowhere, so you have to be very careful. This could easily mess up a live set. But in conclusion, Live 11 looks great, and I'm really excited to upgrade, but the functionality of warping has remained the same since I've been on Live 8. The features I mentioned in this video would be a major improvement to Ableton's warping capability in my opinion. If you also agree or have any other ideas, please comment and let the developers know. Thanks for watching.